I didn't have time to really to include. It would have been way too long. But names like Reverend Leon White from North Carolina, Reverend Bill Land, one of the most amazing community organizers I've ever met in my life. He's an Eden Seminary graduate, by the way. Reverend Joe Copeland, who was in the Southern Conference and ordained women in the old Afro-Christian church in the 1950s. Reverend Barbara Allen, she was the executive minister at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. Everybody knows Jeremiah Wright's name, but not very many people know Barbara Allen. If it hadn't been for Barbara Allen, you wouldn't have seen the phenomenal growth of Trinity, because she was one who was the glue to help hold it all together. Reverend F. Allison Phillips. Al Phillips was the first African-American head of the American Missionary Association. He was a pastor in Cleveland for a number of years. There are lay people who I don't have slides for. Sam Allen was a member of Trinity UCC in Chicago. William Parkinson, I think, was the first president of an organization called United Black Christians in the UCC. Judge Margaret Haywood was a member of the church that I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is People's Congregational Church. She was a judge, but she was also the first African-American woman. I'm not sure about men, but I know she was the first African-American woman who served as a General Senate moderator. So there's lots of, I don't have the slides for those people. There are lots of other names and people that I don't have slides for, but let's just go. So let me share my screen. So this is a short version, warp speed, I say sometimes. This is a warp speed version. Let's start at the beginning. Lemuel Haynes was the first African-American in our country who was ordained into Christian ministry, and he was ordained as a congregational pastor in 1785. He was a Revolutionary War soldier. He was born in West Hartford before there was a Connecticut, because it was still part of England. And he served, as I said, in the militia in the Revolutionary War. He served churches in Vermont and New York for more than 30 years. He was very active in the anti-slavery movement, and he argued against the colonization movement, which wanted to send former enslaved people back to Africa. There used to be, I don't know if it still is, a little church in Queens, New York, named Lemuel Haynes United Church of Christ. This is a name that many of you will not know. This is Margru. Her American name was Sarah Kinson. When I did my thesis many years ago, trying to find out who was the first African-American woman in ministry in our church, I kind of came to the conclusion that she really was. She was on the slave ship, the Amistad, and she was one of the children on the Amistad. There weren't just adults on the Amistad, there were also children. She was one of the children. You remember the story, the Africans took over the boat as they were sailing it from Cuba to the United States, trying to sail back to Africa. It didn't happen. They ended up in Connecticut, and she was one of the children taken in by some of the congregational families there. She was very smart. She was so smart in math and science that she was sent to Oberlin College, where she was the first African to graduate from an American college. She eventually did return to her native Sierra Leone, where she was a missionary and teacher. And she wrote back to the American Missionary Association asking, why didn't they recognize her ministry? So in my eyes, she was the first one. This is the picture I had to hunt down. Now we're jumping way ahead into the early 1900s, like 1930s, 40s, 50s. J. Taylor Stanley and Kathryn Stanley, husband and wife. J. Taylor Stanley was born in 1898 in Alabama. He graduated from Talladega College, which is one of the historically Black UCC related colleges, and also from Howard University Divinity School. He pastored a number of churches in the South before becoming the superintendent, what they called then the superintendent, or the conference minister, really is what he was, of the Convention of the South. The Convention of the South had nothing to do with geography. Let's be real clear. The Convention of the South was a segregated conference of the United Church of Christ, which only had Black churches, which had churches in Connecticut and Massachusetts or New York, wherever they were. If they were Black, they were part of the Convention of the South. So that's people don't talk about that part of our history, but it is part of our history. So he became the conference minister of the Convention of the South. It was created right after the merger of the Congregational and Christian churches in the 1930s. That's his wife in the picture, and I wanted a picture of her too because she was never ordained, but she pastored several churches, mostly smaller churches in the South. So she made her own history in her own way. Their son, his name was A. Knighton Stanley, pastored People's Congregational Church in Washington, D.C., which is my home church, for more than 3 decades. So that's J. Taylor Stanley. You need to know his name if you want to know Black UCC history. Charles Shelby Rooks was an amazing person. He was a respected pastor as well as a recognized administrator. In the 1950s, he served as the pastor of Lincoln Temple Congregational Church in Washington, D.C., which is a very significant church in the nation's capital. He became a very well-known community leader, the head of the Urban League, the president of the Urban League, and just very involved in the Washington, D.C. Black community, probably white community too, but certainly in the Black community. But he was also a scholar, and he served as president of the Fund for Theological Education, which provided support and scholarships for pastors. And he was also the president of the Chicago Theological Seminary and became the first Black president of a predominantly white seminary in the US. And then in his later years, he served for a number of years as the executive vice president, which was the head of the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries. He was an amazing person, very amazing. This is one of my mentors. His name was Charles E. Cobb, Charles Earl Cobb. His son, he's Charles E. Cobb Sr. His son is Charles E. Cobb Jr. And if you've been watching a lot of the PBS documentaries on the SNCC, on the Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you often see interviews with his son, Charles Cobb Jr., who was very active in the leadership of SNCC. But Charles Cobb Sr. was a North Carolina native. He graduated from Howard University and Boston University. He served several churches, but he was serving as a local church pastor in Springfield, Massachusetts, when he was called to be the executive director of the newly formed United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. He's a founder of the National Conference of Black Christians, which was a cross-denomination ecumenical organization of African-American leaders, Christians. He spearheaded the UCC's support of the Wilmington 10. If you know the Wilmington 10 story, you need to know the Wilmington 10 story. It's an important story of Black history in the UCC, where a group of 10 young people were accused of firebombing a grocery store in Wilmington, North Carolina. What they were there doing, actually, they didn't firebomb the store. What they were actually doing was trying to help the community around as the schools were desegregating. Their convictions were later overturned. Dr. Cobb and the next person, the next slide you'll see, Dr. Edmonds. They worked very closely to get the UCC to put up the money to get them bail because they were being held in prison. And he was very instrumental in pressing the UCC to boycott the South Africa. And one of his favorite sayings, and I think was really so much on target, is the United Church of Christ has the proclivity to do right when pushed. And he saw himself, his job was to push. So that's Charles E. Cobb. That bow tie, he usually wore bow ties, and he always carried a matching pipe to his tie or his outfit. So he was quite a dapper guy. His partner in crime was Reverend Dr. Edwin R. Edmonds. Dr. Edmonds was born in Texas. He graduated from Morehouse College and received a doctorate from Boston University in social ethics. But he didn't just study social ethics, he lived it. He was a pastor and civil rights leader in North Carolina until the Ku Klux Klan threatened his family, and finally he was forced to leave. And he and Dr. Cobb, I think they either went to college or seminary together, I can't remember. And Dr. Cobb said to him, well, you need to come to the UCC. He was not a UCC pastor at that time. And he said, you need to come to the UCC. And he ended up at Dixwell Avenue, United Church of Christ in New Haven, which is the oldest African-American UCC church. And he was there for more than 3 decades, I think. And he was very respected and fearless in that community. And he also served as a local community college professor for many years. He was on the UCC Commission for Racial Justice. As a commissioner for many years, he served as the chairperson. And oh, by the way, he did all of this as a blind person. He was one of the most amazing people I've ever met. I don't have pictures of these two, but I wanted to name their names. Percel Alston was from Virginia, from Norfolk. He grew up in the Afro-Christian church. So, you know, if you know our UCC history, we were the Congregational church and the Christian church. Well, in the Christian church, there was a black stream called the Afro-Christian church because the Christian church was mostly in the South, and it was segregated. And Percel Alston grew up in the Afro-Christian church, where he became a pastor. He went to Lincoln University, the Virginia Union University, and got his master's degree from Andover Seminary. He went on to become the director of Christian education for the Convention of the South. Remember when I talked about the Convention of the South? And later, he became an executive in Christian education with the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries. And he was responsible for training hundreds of Christian educators and for educational programs for local churches and church camps and service projects. Reverend Dr. Reuben Shears served for many years as the executive director of the UCC Office of Church Life and Leadership. And that was the agency in the church that was responsible for leadership development, both for clergy and lay leaders in the denomination. He was from South Carolina. He was also a graduate of Talladega College, and and also Colgate Rochester Divinity School, and he got his doctorate from CTS. He served as a pastor in several churches and in several urban ministry agencies before he joined the national staff. And then he left the national staff and he was serving as pastor of the Congregational Church of Park Manor in Chicago when he died in 1992. Okay. All right, many of you may know Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk. She is the first African-American woman ordained into ministry in the UCC. There were some, as I said, that were ordained in the Afro-Christian church before her. She knew of them and knew some of them in person. but she's the first one in the United Church of Christ. She was ordained in 1974. She's also a native of Norfolk, Virginia, and graduated from Norfolk State University and Andover Newton Theological School. She was a protege of Percel Alston, and she began her ministry as a Christian educator. I think it was 1969 when she was called to the UCC Board of Homeland Ministries. Then later she became the Affirmative Action Officer of the church, and then the Executive Director of the Office for Church and Society. And they were very responsible for all of the Just Peace Church work that we did. The Washington office and all the work that they do came under that agency. Then she left the national setting and became the Executive Director of the Community Renewal Society in Chicago. And she was also the founding director of the Center for African American Theological Studies. She is retired now, but she continues to be internationally respected human rights leader and advocate, and much sought after speaker. Maybe you know Reverend Dr. Ben Chavis. Ben Chavis was a North Carolina native, and he was inspired as a young man by Martin Luther King, and he became one of the nation's first political prisoners as a result of his working in Wilmington, North Carolina. That was that Wilmington 10 case I was talking about a minute ago, on behalf of the UCC Commission for Racial Justice. They were falsely accused of arson, and their convictions were later overturned. Ben became the executive director of the Commission for Racial Justice, and during that time he published the Toxic Waste and Race Report. If you know anything about environmental justice, you know that was the seminal study that started the environmental justice movement. And anytime you look at any kind of environmental book that looks at environmental justice, they always will cite that report because it was the first, it was groundbreaking. And oh, by the way, Your Neighbors in Need dollars supported that. So he left the UCC and went on to become the executive director of the NAACP, and then he was serving as the national director of the Million Man March, which many of us remember. And he currently serves as the president of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. Two lay women who are really important. Valerie Russell was an African-American laywoman who received much of her training through her years of work in the YWCA. She was a native of Massachusetts. She served in the national church setting in several different capacities, first as an assistant to the UCC president, that was Bob Moss. And then she was the organizing coordinator of the Coordinating Center for Women. And later she served as the executive director of the Office of Church and Society, that agency that I was talking about that Yvonne Delk had headed. Valerie came after her. She also served for a decade as the executive director of the City Mission Society of Boston, and she was the first woman and the first lay person in that role. Valerie died in, I think it was 1997. Edith Guffey, some of you probably know Edith. She recently retired as a conference minister for the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference after having served more than 30 years in our denomination. She previously has served as the Associate General Minister, which is like the Chief Operating Officer, and as one of the 5 officers of our church. She's a laywoman who brings expertise and administrative management, as well as a commitment to the core values of the UCC. She serves on the National Board of PFLAG. And she's a Midwesterner by birth and previously worked at the University of Kansas, and she continues to live in Lawrence. I put these two together because they both have served as president of the UCC. Joe Evans held the distinction of being the first and only African-American to hold both the positions of Secretary of the United Church of Christ and President of the United Church of Christ. Between 1967 and 1983, he served as the secretary of the denomination, and upon the sudden death of the president, Robert Moss, he was named the third president. Joe Evans was born in Michigan. He grew up in Chicago. He was a graduate of Western Michigan University and Yale Divinity School. He served in a number of churches, including his home church, which is Church of the Good Shepherd in Chicago. He was very active in the community there and became a leader in a number of organizations there. And while he was there, he earned his degree from CTS as well. Joffrey Black, whoops, sorry, I went too fast. Joffrey Black, many of you know, was elected general minister and president in 2009 after serving for 9 years as conference minister of the New York Conference. Before that, I first met Joffrey. He was serving on the national staff in the Office of Church Life and Leadership. But he also had served as a local church pastor in Long Island, in New York City, and as a chaplain at several universities, including Brown University. Robert Yizar from our church was on there. He was one of the students at Brown University when Joffrey was one of the chaplains there. He's a graduate of Lincoln University and Yale Divinity School, and he retired from the national office in 2015. Clyde Miller. Clyde Miller was one of the first African-American conference ministers in the UCC. He served in the Rocky Mountain Conference beginning in 1980. He was an outspoken, colorful, and forceful advocate for social justice. And I'm laughing because I used to always say to people, do you know Clyde Miller? And if they said, well, I'm not sure, I'd say, well, you don't know him, because you never forget Clyde Miller if you ever met him. And he was he lived in Denver until his death in 2011. He was a native of Kentucky, and he studied at Kentucky State University and then served in the armed forces in Korea and returned to graduate from CTS. Benny Whiten, I haven't been able to find a picture of Benny. Benny is still alive, but he's suffering from Alzheimer's. He was a Massachusetts conference minister, and he also served in the national setting as the acting executive minister of Wider Church Ministries. He formerly worked at the Community Renewal Society in Chicago and on the staffs of the New York Conference and the New York City Mission Society. Benny was from Louisiana. He grew up in Louisiana and Texas and attended segregated schools, but he graduated from Texas College and was drafted into military service during the Korean War. And afterwards, he attended Howard University School of Divinity and served as a chaplain at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. That was a hospital for the mentally ill. Benny was a stalwart spokesperson for racial justice for many years. He often spoke from the floor of the General Synod. He served on the board of the Office for Church and Society. And as I said, he's living in Chicago, still alive. I bet that's somebody most of you know, at least know of. You may or may not know he was a UCC pastor. Annie Young graduate, was raised in segregated New Orleans, where his father was a prominent dentist. They grew up he grew up in the UCC. He graduated from Howard University and Hartford Seminary. Despite the disapproval of his father wanted him to become a dentist like he was. After he graduated from seminary, he served in an Alabama Congregational Church, and he became interested in nonviolent resistance, which was the beginning of his civil rights career. And he ended up joining the staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where his work centered on the registration of Black voters. Became the director of SCLC, worked very closely with Dr. King, and was himself arrested on a number of occasions. As we all know, he later became a politician, a diplomat, and the co-chair of the Atlanta Olympic Games. And he was also a businessman, still alive. I always want to include a few local church folks. Jeremiah Wright was pastor of Trinity UCC in Chicago, the largest church in our denomination. When he was called to Chicago, that congregation was tiny. It was a handful of people struggling for life, but he was able to grow that church, preaching liberation theology and the Black church prophetic tradition. Dr. Wright came under attack in the 2008 presidential campaign, because Barack and Michelle Obama were members of Trinity, and his fiery sermons were seen as a way of attacking Obama. But Dr. Wright has taught thousands, literally thousands of Black and white divinity students. He's mentored hundreds of pastors, both in and outside of the UCC, and has been responsible for thousands of people. I said African Americans, but it's really people, because it's broader than that, becoming Christians. Trinity Church has participated fully in the United Church of Christ, and it's shared its treasures and talents generously and continues to be a beacon on the south side of Chicago. You may not know, we have a bishop in the UCC. Her name is Yvette Flunder. She's an extraordinary preacher, womanist preacher, pastor, activist, and singer in Oakland, California. She's the presiding bishop of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, which is a trans-denominational coalition of churches proclaiming the radical love of Jesus. Yvette grew up in the Church of God in Christ, where her family had been in leadership for several generations. Her father was a bishop. I think her grandfather was a bishop too. She was a lead singer in the Walter Hawkins Singers. Some of you may remember them from the 1970s and 80s. In the 1980s, she was called to minister to people living and dying with AIDS, HIV and AIDS in the Mission District of San Francisco. And out of that work grew her ministry, and she started the City of Refuge Church there, which is a part of the United Church of Christ. She's a graduate of San Mateo University, the Pacific School of Religion, and she got her doctorate of ministry at San Francisco Theological Seminary. She too has mentored hundreds of pastors and church leaders. I wanted to include a Missouri person. I hope you know this name, or at least some of you might know this name. If you don't know this name, you should know this name. Buck Jones was one of the most extraordinary community organizers I have ever met. He died in 2002. He was only 62 years old. He worked in both St. Louis and East St. Louis. He was one of the prime organizers of a rent strike in public housing in St. Louis in 1969. And it says out of that worst, but it really should be out of that work. Out of that work, he founded a community organization called Project Hope, which worked in both cities, and to reform welfare and to better serve the lives of poor families. Buck Jones founded the first local Habitat for Humanity chapter there. And later in his life, he was very focused on environmental justice. That's when I met him. He took me around door to door to meet people in the community who had experienced cancer themselves, or members of their families who were living right next to the chemical plants in East St. Louis, and where all the toxic waste was dumped. Extraordinary man, died way too young, very powerful, very quiet, but very forceful. You know Traci Blackmon, also from Missouri. She serves as the Associate General Minister for Justice and Local Church Ministries, and she's formerly pastor at Christ the King in Florissant. She was ordained in the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and she was also a registered nurse with more than 25 years of experience in healthcare. her work as a communal pastor in the days and the weeks after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, just down the road from her church, brought her national and international recognition. And then her colleague is Karen Georgia Thompson, who serves as the Associate General Minister for Wider Church Ministries, where she's responsible for our overseas work and disaster relief and administrative oversight of General Synod. For those of us from Florida, she served here in Florida for a number of years as a local church pastor and on the Florida conference staff. She has roots, her family has roots in Jamaica. She's a graduate of Brooklyn College and has a degree from Union Theological Seminary. That's me. I just thought you might want to know something about me. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. I began working for the denomination in the early 1980s in the Commission for Racial Justice. I attended Union Theological Seminary and became director of the Bishop Tutu Scholarship Fund. And then I went back to CRJ and worked for Paul Sherry, who was our president, for 4 years, and then back to the CRJ as the executive director. I worked as the founding executive minister of Justice and Witness Ministries in 2000 and served as the president of the World Council of Churches also. In 2005, I left the national staff. In 2006, I went to New Orleans to help rebuild Beecher Memorial Congregational Church, which had almost been destroyed by the hurricane. And I've been at First United Church of Tampa since 2009, where I still am. That's it, guys. I don't know if you have questions or anything. I hope you learned something. And I was talking fast, but I had a lot of things I wanted you to see, people I wanted you to meet.
I took notes as best I could, but is there any way I can get a copy of the slideshow?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Thank you so much.
Uh-huh.
You know, I was surprised. I never knew that Andrew Young was part of UCC. I always assumed with his relationship with the other ministers, you know,
Right.
Dr. Martin Luther King. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
A lot of people made that assumption that he was Baptist, but no, he was UCC. He grew up in the UCC. He went to Central Congregational Church in New Orleans. So.
Mm-hmm.
And when you started presenting and all the men were coming up, I was wondering where the women were. I was very happy to see the women there. Whoop, whoop for women.
I knew the women were coming. Yeah. I didn't have a doubt.
And I was happy to know a lot of the women, or know of a lot of the women.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So Pastor, upon reflection, we know presence is very important, and physical presence and leadership, of course. But what are your thoughts about the impact that these various people have had on institutionalized change within our church, our denomination?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, I've thought about that a lot through the years. I think several things. I think it's no accident that we had people in place in leadership positions for many years, and we also had a number of historically Black colleges that we maintain relationships with. So Dillard, you're from New Orleans, Daphne. Right. So Dillard was a UCC, you know, a related college. And so I think that was an important training ground for many African American people who ended up being leaders in our church. So I think that was really important. I think that in many ways we've had a number of African Americans in leadership in our denomination at various, you know, different places. I didn't, like I said, I know that I left a lot of people out. So I think that's important. I think the challenge now quite honestly, is the same challenge that our nation is. Okay, we've got these people. What are we going to do with them? How do we change ourselves? You know, it's more than just having the bodies there.
Right.
We've got to change. It's got to be, the change has to be deeper than just having the people in place. You've got to be willing to do the hard work, the anti-racism work, and unlearn some of what we've all learned, and in order to move to the next level, I think.
Definitely.
Pastor Jackson, I found this very educational for me from the way I was brought up and what I'm learning now. I found it very interesting and educational. Thank you for putting it on.
I'm glad you're here, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Pastor, in regards to the most of the people in positions and the ones that you spoke of, they're I don't want to call them, say, old, but up in age. What's being done within the organization to kind of mold the young folks to take over? Because it's been known that when skills and knowledge, when someone has all these skills and knowledge and they leave or they pass on, that goes with them, and it's so important to pass that knowledge to the young generation so that they will continue, and instead of starting new, they will just continue, pick up where a person left off.
Yeah. All these people are people kind of mostly of the past, because it's a history presentation.
Right.
There are some amazing young African-American leaders in our church, in our denomination. Pastors, I mean, they're doing, the dean at Eden Seminary is an African-American woman who will just knock your socks off. There's just, there are a lot of them. And I don't even know who all of them are, because I'm not there working in the national setting anymore, so I'm not exposed to all of them. But there's some really, really good young people who are doing amazing work. So I'm not too worried about the future, as long as they're there and doing their work. So that's a really important point, though. Ben Chavis used to say all the time, the best way to honor Black history is to make some. So I agree with that.
I have a question. There were a couple of folk in the presentation that you said graduated from Lincoln University. Now, we have a Lincoln University here in Missouri, and
no, they graduate from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania.
Okay, I knew that there was another one.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And the Lincoln University in Pennsylvania is an African-American university outside of Philadelphia. So that's the one that they went to. So that's a good question.
And here is also a historically Black college.
Yes, it is.
I happen to be an alumni of that school, so.
Yeah.
Well, that's not surprising, because whenever you hear that Lincoln name, it's probably attached to something that has something to do with African. My parents are buried in Washington, D.C. at a cemetery called Lincoln Cemetery, which is the Black cemetery. See, we even were segregated when it came to where we were buried. They were buried at Lincoln Cemetery in Washington, D.C. So it's not always the case, but a lot of times if you hear that Lincoln, you're right. It's related to African Americans.
Pastor, I was surprised. I never knew that there was women aboard the Amistad, and it appeared that the young lady who maintained her original name from Sierra Leone, and then she was such a strong, well, of course, a very talented young woman, which demystify all those thoughts about these natives that weren't highly educated, and then went back to Sierra Leone to live out her life and continue her ministry.
Yeah.
I remember once I took a trip to Ghana, and everywhere you saw the symbol of God, and they said we knew God before the Christians came, which is sort of ironic.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I thank you for this opportunity. It was fun for me to do and to dig out some pictures and to think about people. Like I said, there's lots of other people I'm sure should be in here and aren't, but at least it's a good first stab at it.
I do have a question for you. I was waiting for everybody else. Can you talk a little bit about the CRJ? That was another organization that keeps popping up. And just when did that start? And how did it start? And what is that all about?
The Commission for Racial Justice was started in the 1960s. It was called the Committee for Racial Justice Now. It was started by the General Synod in response to all the civil rights activities going on in the country. And then it actually, you know, they took some time, I don't know how many years, a number of years to really get organized, and it became the Commission for Racial Justice, which was what we used to call instrumentality. It was an agency that was created by General Synod. There were 18 commissioners from various parts of the church, a combination of lay people and clergy, both not just African American, they were from all different communities. The commission was a lot of people in this country, in the religious communities, knew about the Commission for Racial Justice, and in the community organizing communities. The community organizing people couldn't figure out why were these church people involved in this civil rights stuff. But there they were. It was that was before me. There they were. So like I said, the work on environmental justice came out of the Commission for Racial Justice. When I first went to work at the Commission for Racial Justice, I was hired to run a program on how to get churches involved in doing ministry to women in prison. So they were interested in many criminal justice issues. The Wilmington 10 I talked about, just a lot of educational equity in various communities. We had offices in Washington, D.C., in North Carolina, and as well as in New York. And then, well, when we moved to Cleveland, that was when they started. Well, I guess we were there for 10 years before we actually merged different agencies into Justice and Witness. But yeah, it was a very important agency. It worked very much in the community. It worked across denominations. It worked with, it had a lot of good contacts with people in the Muslim community and the Black Muslim community, very well known. It hired community organizers. Whoa.
Thank you. And I did have one other question. Just, there's a lot of, when talking about Jeremiah Wright, you used a couple of terms that some folks may not be familiar with. And I'm interested to hear your definition of them. When you talked about his preaching, you talked about him preaching liberation theology in the Black prophetic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
How would you define that? What does that mean to you, that tradition and theological framework?
It's speaking truth to power. And it's unafraid to speak truth to power. So, you know, during the 2008 election, that little clip that they played of Jeremiah Wright's preaching was one 1-minute clip of a 40-year career. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I don't want anybody to take 1 minute of what I say out of 40 years and say, this is what I'm about. Right. Because any 1 minute might be the wrong 1 minute. It might have been the 1 minute when, you know, I just didn't get up that good that morning or whatever, you know, or where I overemphasized what I shouldn't have. And all of us have done that. So unfortunately, that's what happened. But the Black church prophetic tradition is one that is unafraid of speaking about politics and about politicians and calling them out when you see injustice. You know, many of our churches are not used to that, but that's part of that tradition. It's been there all along. It had to be all along in order to for the community to trust it and believe it. And so that's part of that tradition.
Yeah, thank you.
May I add something, Pastor? That 1 minute that you made reference to, you have to listen to the whole sermon.
Right.
If you listen to the whole sermon, you would get a whole different perspective. Well,
Yeah.
and you would see how someone slanted just that one, a couple of comments that he made.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, you can't even use one sermon for 40 years of preaching. That's not fair either. So you're right, though.
The other thing I wanted to point out was Edith Guffey. First of all, I had no idea she was a layperson.
Was never ordained.
Even though I,
She's
have a connection with her, but we owe her a debt of gratitude because she made this happen. It was Edith that recommended I get a hold of you for this. So
yeah, Edith and I used to work together for a number of years, so she knew I'd been around a long time.
Well, are there any other questions or anything from anybody?
I want to thank you for putting this together and for Dr. Jackson being with us. This has been so enlightening. And I'm old enough to have known many of these people. And I'm gratified to have seen them this evening.
Yeah.
Amazing, wonderful history that you pointed out for us. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, they were all amazing. You're absolutely right. All amazing.
Good to have you with us tonight.
It's great to be here, and it's nice to meet all of you. And I'm glad a number of members of our church were able to come, because I think they were interested in knowing that history too, because even though they hear it bits and pieces, it's different when you hear it all put together. So
Yeah, it looks like Margaret has her hand raised here.
hi, Margaret.
Yeah, I got here kind of late, and I see that this is recorded, and I wonder what is going to happen afterwards so that this might be available. I would like to hear more about the early history. Is this going to be someplace where I can access this again?
I'll put it on our YouTube channel and send the link to Dr. Powell Jackson, and she can share it with
That'd
you.
be great. That'd be great. Well, maybe we could close in a word of prayer.
Before you pray,
Yes.
to give an unsolicited testimonial. I'm a retired ELCA pastor, but I've been doing pulpit supply in 2 UCC congregations in the neighborhood over the last year and a couple of months. And I am very impressed with the work that you, Dr. Powell Jackson, have done, and that the UCC has done generally with regard to human relations. And I want to thank you very, very much for tonight and for all the good work you've done.
Thank you. And I think it is important to say that I'm a part and we're a part of a long tradition. So that's one of the things that I hope we all take away, is that this is part of who our church has been since the beginning, since the 1700s. So that's pretty amazing. Well, why don't we close with prayer?
Yes, ma'am.
Gracious and holy God, we just thank you. We thank you for this time together, for each one gathered. We thank you for those whose names we called aloud tonight, and those whose names we may not even know, but who have opened up doorways and pathways and made it possible for us to be where we are. And we pray for the young people coming up, that they might be strengthened by these stories, that they might be able to do new things in this world, that they might change this world, transform this world. So we pray for them, for their strength and their courage. And we pray for our beloved United Church of Christ, that we might continue to do this work that you give us to do, because this is your work and this is your world. We pray all of this in the beautiful name of our liberator and our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you so much.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks again.
Good night,
All
everyone.
right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.